On paper, the Galactic Empire should win almost immediately, not after years of war, not after dramatic turning points, but decisively and irreversibly, because every structural advantage that determines real conflict sits overwhelmingly in its favour, from industrial capacity to intelligence dominance, from centralised command to sheer numerical mass, all operating at a scale the rebellion never comes close to matching. The Empire controls the means of production across thousands of systems, owning or regulating shipyards, arms manufacturers, fuel networks and hyperspace infrastructure, giving it the ability to replace losses faster than the rebels can even organise them, a disparity that alone should make sustained insurgency functionally impossible. Logistics, the silent determinant of all wars, also belongs entirely to the Empire, with standardised supply chains, dedicated military transport corridors, and institutional continuity that allows it to project force anywhere in the galaxy without improvisation, while the rebellion survives on stolen equipment, retrofitted ships, and perpetual scarcity. Manpower follows the same pattern, as the Empire can draw from an almost inexhaustible population base, conscripting soldiers, pilots, technicians, analysts, and administrators faster than the rebels can recruit volunteers, ensuring that attrition always favours the centralised state rather than the fragmented resistance. Even intelligence overwhelmingly favours the Empire, which possesses galaxy-spanning surveillance, informant networks, and bureaucratic reach, allowing it to track trade routes, communications, and population movement at a level of granularity no insurgent force should realistically evade for long. Against this, the rebellion has no comparable structure, relying instead on secrecy, compartmentalisation, and luck, not as force multipliers, but as survival mechanisms, which can sustain evasion temporarily, but cannot win wars without the enemy making repeated, implausible errors. This is why nearly every major rebel victory hinges on a single catastrophic vulnerability conveniently exposed at precisely the right moment, whether it is the thermal exhaust port of the Death Star or an unguarded shield generator on Endor, moments where the Empire's otherwise overwhelming advantage collapses into narrative fragility. In real conflicts, centralised powers lose not because they are large, but because they fracture internally, suffer sustained economic collapse, or are strategically outmanoeuvred over time, none of which meaningfully occur within the Empire before its decisive defeats, making its downfall feel less earned and more orchestrated. The Empire's failure to adapt is particularly telling, because institutions of that scale are built around redundancy and learning. Yet the story repeatedly forces incompetence onto imperial command to preserve tension, slowing response times, isolating decision-makers, and preventing systemic correction that should naturally occur. After the destruction of the first Death Star, the logical response would be massive doctrinal reform, security overhaul, and decentralised hardening of critical infrastructure. Yet the Empire instead rebuilds the same superweapon with the same vulnerability, a choice that serves mythic symmetry rather than strategic sense. This pattern extends to fleet deployment, counterinsurgency tactics, and intelligence failures, where the Empire behaves not like a paranoid authoritarian state obsessed with control, but like a static antagonist waiting to be exploited. Its power immense but strangely passive, unless the plot requires immediate threat. The rebels, by contrast, are rarely shown paying sustained costs for failure, losing bases but never momentum, suffering casualties but never structural collapse, and emerging from defeats functionally intact, an outcome that undermines the very stakes the story claims to establish. Losses that should cripple a resistance instead become transitional beats, while imperial defeats are treated as existential, creating an imbalance where power dynamics exist only rhetorically rather than operationally, and where the outcome feels predetermined regardless of plausibility. In this framing, the Empire stops being a governing force and becomes a narrative obstacle, a towering presence designed to be overcome rather than a system designed to endure, its cruelty exaggerated, while its competence is selectively diminished to maintain heroic symmetry. This matters because Star Wars positions itself as a story about power, oppression, and resistance, yet by allowing the rebellion to win through miracle victories rather than sustained superiority, it risks transforming that struggle into a fairy tale rather than a cautionary tragedy. A realistic outcome where the Empire initially crushes the rebellion or forces it into generational struggle, would have reinforced a harsher truth: that immoral power does not fall simply because it is wrong, but only when it is decisively outmatched, economically, strategically, or internally. Instead, the narrative shields the audience from that discomfort, ensuring that righteousness aligns with victory, and that hope triumphs regardless of material reality, a choice that serves myth, but weakens stakes by insulating protagonists from the full consequences of imbalance. The result is a galaxy where tyranny feels fragile and resistance feels inevitable, not because of sacrifice or superior planning, but because the story requires moral alignment to equal success, flattening complexity into reassurance. This does not mean the story fails emotionally, but it does mean it sidesteps a darker, more challenging truth: that most oppressive systems persist precisely because they are efficient, adaptable, and brutally effective, and that overthrowing them requires more than courage and faith. Seen this way, the Empire's defeat is not a failure of logic within its own framework, but a concession to mythic storytelling, where inevitability replaces uncertainty, and where the audience is spared the possibility that the galaxy might remain unjust despite heroic effort. That tension between myth and realism defines the entire conflict, setting up the deeper question of whether Star Wars is strengthened or weakened by choosing hope over plausibility, and whether the cost of that choice is the erosion of genuine stakes. Once the rebellion begins winning decisively, the nature of the conflict subtly but permanently changes, because victory without proportional cost does not escalate tension, it dissolves it, transforming danger into spectacle, and oppression into a temporary inconvenience rather than an entrenched reality that must be dismantled piece by piece. A rebellion that survives on miracle victories may inspire hope, but it does not earn inevitability. And when those miracles accumulate without compounding sacrifice, the war ceases to feel like a grinding struggle against impossible odds, and instead resembles a sequence of puzzles the protagonists are destined to solve. The core issue is not that the rebels win individual engagements, but that their wins rarely demand structural trade-offs. They lose bases, but not capability, leaders, but not coherence, ships, but not reach, creating the impression of infinite resilience without the industrial or demographic foundations that resilience requires. Meanwhile, every imperial defeat is framed as existential, as though the loss of a single station or fleet segment undermines an empire that spans the galaxy, collapsing credibility by implying that centralized power is brittle rather than oppressive, fragile rather than suffocating. This imbalance reshapes the empire into a narrative prop rather than a lived system, a force that exists primarily to be opposed rather than to govern, stripping it of the mundane, grinding effectiveness that defines real authoritarian regimes, where control is maintained not through superweapons alone, but through bureaucracy, exhaustion, and inevitability. By focusing on dramatic choke points rather than sustained campaigns, the story avoids depicting how insurgencies are usually crushed through attrition, surveillance saturation, and population control, mechanisms the empire should logically excel at given its scale and resources. The absence of long-term rebel deprivation is especially telling, because real resistance movements are defined less by their victories than by what they are forced to endure. Years of scarcity, internal fracture, and moral compromise, yet the rebellion retains cohesion, optimism, and operational clarity far beyond what its circumstances justify. This framing protects the audience from confronting an uncomfortable truth: that courage alone does not topple empires, and that morality does not inherently confer strategic advantage, a truth that would complicate the saga's hopeful tone but deepen its thematic weight. Instead, the story consistently bends the empire into incompetence, slowing its response, isolating its leadership, and preventing learning curves that should naturally follow catastrophic failure, ensuring that rebel ingenuity always arrives just in time to exploit stagnation. After the destruction of the Death Star, an institution like the Empire would logically decentralize command, harden infrastructure, and flood contested regions with overwhelming force, yet the narrative resets conditions so that the rebels remain viable without fundamentally altering their operating model. This narrative generosity extends to the portrayal of imperial governance, which is rarely shown as effective or even functional. reducing the Empire to a caricature of evil rather than a system that delivers order, however brutally, to vast populations who might otherwise resist rebel disruption. As a result, the galaxy feels curiously weightless, as though control is maintained only by fear and collapses instantly once fear is challenged, ignoring how deeply authoritarian systems entrench themselves through incentives, compliance, and normalized violence. This undermines the stakes because the audience never truly believes the Empire can win in the end, not because the rebels are superior, but because the story refuses to let centralized power behave like centralized power, turning inevitability into foregone conclusion. A rebel loss or even a prolonged stalemate ending in compromise, rather than triumph, would have reframed the saga as tragedy tempered by hope, reinforcing the idea that resistance matters even when victory is uncertain, and that moral action is meaningful regardless of outcome. Such an ending would have aligned more closely with the darker undercurrents of Star Wars, that systems of power rarely fall cleanly, and that defeating them often requires generational effort, internal decay, or overwhelming counterforce, rather than a single decisive blow. Instead, the rebels are rewarded with rapid success that feels symbolic rather than earned, reinforcing the myth that righteousness guarantees triumph, a comforting notion that smooths over the harsher reality that unjust systems often endure precisely because they are efficient. This choice does not invalidate the story's emotional power, but it does narrow its philosophical scope, replacing cautionary realism with reassurance, and transforming what could have been a meditation on resistance into a parable where victory is assured by alignment rather than strategy. In this framework, the Empire exists to be defeated, not to be understood, and once that defeat is assured, the stakes collapse inward, leaving spectacle in place of tension and nostalgia in place of consequence. Star Wars chooses myth over realism deliberately, and that choice resonates with audiences because it affirms hope, but it also limits the story's ability to grapple with the truth that power does not fall simply because it is immoral. It falls only when it is broken from within or crushed from without. By allowing the rebellion to win without fully earning that outcome through sustained sacrifice and strategic superiority, the saga trades depth for catharsis, ensuring emotional satisfaction while quietly diminishing the weight of the struggle it depicts. In the end, the Empire's defeat is less a lesson about resistance than a reaffirmation of mythic structure, where good prevails because it must, not because it has overcome an enemy operating at full capacity. And while that choice defines Star Wars' identity, it also explains why the conflict feels resolved rather than reckoned with. The galaxy is saved, but the darker truth remains unexplored, that in most realities, power persists until it is truly outmatched, and that hope alone, no matter how righteous, is rarely enough to bring an empire down.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.